Chapter 1 of Stories of Successful Marriages. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Stories of Successful Marriages, edited by Walter Besant. Section 1. The Manchester Marriage, Part 1, by Elizabeth Gaskell. From Household Words, Christmas 1858. Mr. and Mrs. Openshaw came from Manchester to settle in London. He had been, what is called in Lancashire, a salesman for a large manufacturing firm, who were extending their business and opening a warehouse in the city, where Mr. Openshaw was now to superintend their affairs. He rather enjoyed the change, having a kind of curiosity about London, which he had never yet been able to gratify in his brief visits to the metropolis. At the same time he had an odd, shrewd contempt for the inhabitants, whom he always pictured to himself as fine, lazy people, caring nothing but for fashion and aristocracy, and lounging away their days in Bond Street and such places, ruining good English, and ready in their turn to despise him as a provincial. The hours that the men of business kept in the city scandalized him too, accustomed as he was to the early dinners of Manchester folk and the consequently far longer evenings. Still, he was pleased to go to London, though he would not for the world have confessed it, even to himself, and always spoke of the step to his friends as one demanded of him by the interests of his employers, and sweetened to him by a considerable increase of salary. This, indeed, was so liberal that he might have been justified in taking a much larger house than the one he did, had he not thought himself bound to set an example to Londoners of how little a Manchester man of business cared for show. Inside, however, he furnished it with an unusual degree of comfort, and in the winter-time he insisted on keeping up as large fires as the grates would allow, in every room where the temperature was in the least chilly. Moreover, his northern sense of hospitality was such that, if he were at home, he could hardly suffer a visitor to leave the house without forcing meat and drink upon him. Every servant in the house was well warmed, well fed, and kindly treated, for their master scorned all petty saving in aught that conduced to comfort, while he amused himself by following out all his accustomed habits and individual ways, in defiance of what any of his new neighbours might think. His wife was a pretty gentlewoman of suitable age and character. He was 42, she 35. He was loud and decided, she soft and yielding. They had 2 children, or rather, I should say, she had 2, for the elder, a girl of 11, was Mrs. Openshaw's child by Frank Wilson, her first husband. The younger was a little boy, Edwin, who could just prattle, and to whom his father delighted to speak in the broadest and most unintelligible Lancashire dialect, in order to keep up what he called the true Saxon accent. Mrs. Openshaw's Christian name was Alice, and her first husband had been her own cousin. She was the orphan niece of a sea captain in Liverpool, a quiet, grave little creature, of great personal attraction when she was 15 or 16, with regular features and a blooming complexion. But she was very shy, and believed herself to be very stupid and awkward, and was frequently scolded by her aunt, her own uncle's second wife. So when her cousin, Frank Wilson, came home from a long absence at sea, and first was kind and protective to her, secondly attentive, and thirdly desperately in love with her, she hardly knew how to be grateful enough to him. It is true, she would have preferred his remaining in the first or second stages of behaviour, for his violent love puzzled and frightened her. Her uncle neither helped nor hindered the love affair, though it was going on under his own eyes. Frank's stepmother had such a variable temper that there was no knowing whether what she liked one day she would like the next or not. At length she went to such extremes of crossness that Alice was only too glad to shut her eyes and rush blindly at the chance of escape from domestic tyranny offered her by a marriage with her cousin, and liking him better than anyone in the world, except her uncle, who was at this time at sea, she went off one morning and was married to him, her only bridesmaid being the housemaid at her aunt's. The consequence was that Frank and his wife went into lodgings, and Mrs. Wilson refused to see them, and turned away Nora, the warm-hearted housemaid, whom they accordingly took into their service. When Captain Wilson returned from his voyage he was very cordial with the young couple, and spent many an evening at their lodgings, smoking his pipe and sipping his grog. But he told them, for quietness' sake, he could not ask them to his own house, for his wife was bitter against them. They were not, however, very unhappy about this. The seed of future unhappiness lay rather in Frank's vehement, passionate disposition, which led him to resent his wife's shyness and want of demonstrativeness as failures in conjugal duty. He was already tormenting himself, and her too, in a slighter degree, by apprehensions and imaginations of what might befall her during his approaching absence at sea. At last he went to his father, and urged him to insist upon Alice's being once more received under his roof, the more especially as there was now a prospect of her confinement while her husband was away on his voyage. Captain Wilson was, as he himself expressed it, breaking up, and unwilling to undergo the excitement of a scene. Yet he felt that what his son said was true. So he went to his wife, and before Frank set sail, he had the comfort of seeing his wife installed in her old little garret in his father's house. To have placed her in one of the best spare rooms was a step beyond Mrs. Wilson's powers of submission or generosity. The worst part about it, however, was that the faithful Nora had to be dismissed. Her place as housemaid had been filled up, and, even if it had not, she had forfeited Mrs. Wilson's good opinion for ever. She comforted her young master and mistress by pleasant prophecies of the time when they would have a household of their own, of which, whatever service she might be in meanwhile, she should be sure to form a part. Almost the last action Frank did before setting sail was going with Alice to see Nora once more at her mother's house, and then he went away. Alice's father-in-law grew more and more feeble as winter advanced. She was of great use to her stepmother in nursing and amusing him, and although there was anxiety enough in the household, there was, perhaps, more of peace than there had been for years, for Mrs. Wilson had not a bad heart, and was softened by the visible approach of death to one whom she loved, and touched by the lonely condition of the young creature expecting her first confinement in her husband's absence. To this relenting mood Nora owed the permission to come and nurse Alice when her baby was born, and to remain and attend on Captain Wilson. Before one letter had been received from Frank, who had sailed for the East Indies and China, his father died. Alice was always glad to remember that he had held her baby in his arms, and kissed and blessed it before his death. After that, and the consequent examination into the state of his affairs, it was found that he had left far less property than people had been led, by his style of living, to expect, and what money there was settled all upon his wife, and at her disposal after her death. This did not signify much to Alice, as Frank was now first mate of his ship, and, in another voyage or two, would be captain. Meanwhile he had left her rather more than £200, all his savings, in the bank. It became time for Alice to hear from her husband. One letter from the Cape she had already received. The next was to announce his arrival in India. As week after week passed over, and no intelligence of the ship having got there reached the office of the owners, and the captain's wife was in the same state of ignorant suspense as Alice herself, her fears grew most oppressive. At length the day came when, in reply to her inquiry at the shipping office, they told her that the owners had given up hope of ever hearing more of the Betsy Jane, and had sent in their claim upon the underwriters. Now that he was gone for ever, she first felt a yearning, longing love for the kind cousin, the dear friend, the sympathizing protector, whom she should never see again. First felt a passionate desire to show him his child, whom she had hitherto rather craved to have all to herself, her own sole possession. Her grief was, however, noiseless and quiet, rather to the scandal of Mrs Wilson, who bewailed her stepson as if he and she had always lived together in perfect harmony, and who evidently thought it her duty to burst into fresh tears at every strange face she saw, dwelling on this poor young widow's desolate state, and the helplessness of the fatherless child, with an unction as if she liked the excitement of the sorrowful story. So passed away the first days of Alice's widowhood. By and by things subsided into their natural and tranquil course. But, as if the young creature was always to be in some heavy trouble, her ewe-lamb began to be ailing, pining, and sickly. The child's mysterious illness turned out to be some affection of the spine, likely to affect health, but not to shorten life. At least, so the doctors said. But the long dreary suffering of one whom a mother loves as Alice loved her only child is hard to look forward to. Only Nora guessed what Alice suffered. No one but God knew. And so it fell out that when Mrs Wilson, the elder, came to her one day in violent distress, occasioned by a very material diminution in the value of the property that her husband had left her, a diminution which made her income barely enough to support herself, much less Alice, the latter could hardly understand how anything which did not touch health or life could cause such grief, and she received the intelligence with irritating composure. But when, that afternoon, the little sick child was brought in, and the grandmother, who, after all, loved it well, began a fresh moan over the losses to its unconscious ears, saying how she had planned to consult this or that doctor, and to give it this or that comfort or luxury in after years, but that now all chance of this had passed away, Alice's heart was touched, and she drew near to Mrs Wilson with unwonted caresses, and, in a spirit not unlike to that of Ruth, entreated that, come what would, they might remain together. After much discussion in succeeding days, it was arranged that Mrs Wilson should take a house in Manchester, furnishing it partly with what furniture she had, and providing the rest with Alice's remaining £200. Mrs Wilson was herself a Manchester woman, and naturally longed to return to her native town. Some connections of her own, too, at that time required lodgings, for which they were willing to pay pretty handsomely. Alice undertook the active superintendence and superior work of the household. Nora, willing, faithful Nora, offered to cook, scour, do anything in short, so that she might but remain with them. The plan succeeded. For some years their first lodgers remained with them, and all went smoothly, with that one sad exception of the little girl's increasing deformity. How that mother loved that child, it is not for words to tell. Then came a break of misfortune. Their lodgers left, and no one succeeded to them. After some months, it became necessary to remove to a smaller house, and Alice's tender conscience was torn by the idea that she ought not to be a burden to her mother-in-law, but to go out and seek her own maintenance, and leave her child. The thought came like the sweeping boom of a funeral bell over her heart. By and by Mr Openshaw came to lodge with them. He had started in life as the errand-boy and sweeper out of a warehouse, had struggled up through all the grades of employment in it, fighting his way through the hard, striving Manchester life with strong, pushing energy of character. Every spare moment of time had been sternly given up to self-teaching. He was a capital accountant, a good French and German scholar, a keen, far-seeing tradesman, understanding markets and the bearing of events, both near and distant, on trade, and yet with such vivid attention to present details that I do not think he ever saw a group of flowers in the fields without thinking whether their colour would, or would not, form harmonious contrasts in the coming spring muslins and prints. He went to debating societies, and threw himself with all his heart and soul into politics, esteeming, it must be owned, every man a fool or a knave who differed from him, and overthrowing his opponents rather by the loud strength of his language than the calm strength of his logic. There was something of the Yankee in all this. Indeed, his theory ran parallel to the famous Yankee motto, "England flogs creation, and Manchester flogs England." Such a man, as may be fancied, had had no time for falling in love, or any such nonsense. At the age when most young men go through their courting and matrimony, he had not the means of keeping a wife, and was far too practical to think of having one. And now that he was in easy circumstances, a rising man, he considered women almost as encumbrances to the world, with whom a man had better have as little to do as possible. His first impression of Alice was indistinct, and he had not care enough about her to make it distinct. A pretty yea-nay kind of woman would have been his description of her, if he had been pushed into a corner. He was rather afraid, in the beginning, that her quiet ways arose from a listlessness and laziness of character, which would have been exceedingly discordant to his active, energetic nature. But when he found out the punctuality with which his wishes were attended to, and her work was done, when he was called in the morning at the very stroke of the clock, his shaving water scalding hot, his fire bright, his coffee made exactly as his peculiar fancy dictated, for he was a man who had his theory about everything based upon what he knew of science, and often perfectly original. Then he began to think, not that Alice had any particular merit, but that he had got into a remarkably good lodgings. His restlessness wore away, and he began to consider himself as almost settled for life in them. Mr Openshaw had been too busy, all his days, to be introspective. He did not know that he had any tenderness in his nature, and if he had become conscious of its abstract existence, he would have considered it as a manifestation of disease in some part of him. But he was decoyed into pity unawares, and pity led on to tenderness. That little helpless child, always carried about by one of the 3 busy women of the house, or else patiently threading coloured beads in the chair from which, by no effort of its own, could it never move. The great grave blue eyes, full of serious, not uncheerful expression, giving to the small delicate face a look beyond its years. The soft plaintive voice dropping out but few words, so unlike the continual prattle of a child, caught Mr Openshaw's attention in spite of himself. One day, he half scorned himself for doing so, he cut short his dinner hour to go in search of some toy which should take the place of those eternal beads. I forget what he bought, but when he gave the present, which he took care to do in a short abrupt manner, and when no one else was by to see him, he was almost thrilled by the flash of delight that came over that child's face, and he could not help, all through that afternoon, going over and over again the picture left on his memory by the bright effect of unexpected joy on the little girl's face. When he returned home he found his slippers placed by his sitting-room fire, and even more careful attention paid to his fancies than was habitual in those model lodgings. When Alice had taken the last of his tea-things away, she had been silent as usual till then. She stood for an instant with the door in her hand. Mr Openshaw looked as if he were deep in his book, though, in fact, he did not see a line, but was heartily wishing the woman would go, and not make any palaver of gratitude. But she only said, "I am very much obliged to you, sir. Thank you very much," and was gone, even before he could send her away with a "There, my good woman, that's enough." For some time longer he took no apparent notice of the child. He even hardened his heart into disregarding her sudden flush of colour and little timid smile of recognition when he saw her by chance. But, after all, this could not last for ever, and, having a second time given way to tenderness, there was no relapse. The insidious enemy, having thus entered his heart in the guise of compassion to the child, soon assumed the more dangerous form of interest in the mother. He was aware of this change of feeling, despised himself for it, struggled with it, nay, internally yielded to it and cherished it, long before he suffered the slightest expression of it, by word, action, or look to escape him. He watched Alice's docile, obedient ways to her stepmother, the love which she had inspired in the rough Nora, roughened by the wear and tear of sorrow and years. But, above all, he saw the wild, deep, passionate affection existing between her and her child. They spoke little to anyone else, or when anyone else was by. But, when alone together, they talked, and murmured, and cooed, and chattered so continually that Mr Openshaw first wondered what they could find to say to each other, and next became irritated because they were always so grave and silent with him. All this time he was perpetually devising small new pleasures for the child. His thoughts ran, in a pertinacious way, upon the desolate life before her, and often he came back from his day's work loaded with the very thing Alice had been longing for, but had not been able to procure. One time it was a little chair for drawing the little sufferer along the streets, and many an evening that following summer Mr Openshaw drew her along himself, regardless of the remarks of his acquaintances. One day in autumn he put down his newspaper, as Alice came in with the breakfast, and said, in as indifferent a voice as he could assume, "Mrs Frank, is there any reason why we two should not put up our horses together?" Alice stood still in perplexed wonder. What did he mean? He had resumed the reading of his newspaper, as if he did not expect any answer. So she found silence her safest course, and went on quietly arranging his breakfast, without another word passing between them. Just as he was leaving the house to go to the warehouse as usual, he turned back and put his head into the bright, neat, tidy kitchen, where all the women breakfasted in the morning. "You'll think of what I said, Mrs Frank," this was her name with the lodgers, "and let me have your opinion upon it to-night." Alice was thankful that her mother and Nora were too busy talking together to attend much to this speech. She determined not to think about it at all through the day, and, of course, the effort not to think made her think all the more. At night she sent up Nora with his tea, but Mr Openshaw almost knocked Nora down as she was going out at the door, by pushing past her and calling out, "Mrs Frank!" in an impatient voice, at the top of the stairs. Alice went up, rather than seem to have affixed too much meaning to his words. "Well, Mrs Frank," he said, "what answer? Don't make it too long, for I have lots of office work to get through to-night." "I hardly know what you meant, sir," said truthful Alice. "Well, I should have thought you might have guessed. You're not new at this sort of work, and I am. However, I'll make it plain this time. Will you have me to be thy wedded husband, and serve me, and love me, and honour me, and all that sort of thing? Because, if you will, I will do as much by you, and be a father to your child, and that's more than is put in the prayer book. Now, I'm a man of my word, and what I say I feel, and what I promise I'll do. Now, for your answer." Alice was silent. He began to make the tea, as if her reply was a matter of perfect indifference to him. But, as soon as that was done, he became impatient. "Well?" said he. "How long, sir, may I have to think over it?" "3 minutes," looking at his watch. "You've had 2 already. That makes 5. Be a sensible woman, say yes, and sit down to tea with me, and we'll talk it over together, for after tea I shall be busy. Say no," he hesitated a moment, to try to keep his voice in the same tone, "and I shan't say another word about it, but pay up a year's rent for my rooms to-morrow, and be off. Time's up. Yes or no?" "If you please, sir, you have been so good to little Ailsie." "There, sit down comfortably by me on the sofa, and let's have our tea together. I am glad to find you are as good and sensible as I took you for." And this was Alice Wilson's second wooing. Mr Openshaw's will was too strong, and his circumstances too good, for him not to carry all before him. He settled Mrs Wilson in a comfortable house of her own, and made her quite independent of lodgers. and little that Alice said with regard to future plans was in Nora's behalf. "No," said Mr Openshaw, "Nora shall take care of the old lady as long as she lives, and, after that, she shall either come and live with us, or, if she likes it better, she shall have a provision for life. For your sake, missus. No one who has been good to you or the child shall go unrewarded. But even the little one will be better for some fresh stuff about her. Get her a bright, sensible girl as a nurse, one who won't go rubbing her with calf's foot jelly, as Nora does, wasting good stuff outside that ought to go in, but will follow doctor's directions, which, as you must see pretty clearly by this time, Nora won't, because they give the poor little wench pain. Now, I'm not above being nesh for other folks myself. I can stand a good blow, and never change colour, but set me in the operating room in the infirmary, and I turn as sick as a girl. Yet, if need were, I would hold the little wench on my knees while she screeched with pain, if it were to do her back good. Nay, nay, wench, keep your white looks for the time when it comes. I don't say it ever will, but this I know, Nora will spare the child and cheat the doctor, if she can. Now, I say, give the bairn a year or two's chance, and then, when the pack of doctors have done their best, and maybe the old lady has gone, we'll have Nora back, or do better for her." The pack of doctors could do no good to little Ailsie. She was beyond their power. But her father, for so he insisted on being called, and also on Alice's no longer retaining the appellation of mamma, but becoming henceforward mother, by his healthy cheerfulness of manner, his clear decision of purpose, his odd turns and quirks of humour, added to his real strong love for the helpless little girl, infused a new element of brightness and confidence into her life, and though her back remained the same, her general health was strengthened, and Alice, never going beyond a smile herself, had the pleasure of seeing her child taught to laugh. As for Alice's own life, it was happier than it had ever been before. Mr Openshaw required no demonstration, no expressions of affection from her. Indeed, these would rather have disgusted him. Alice could love deeply, but could not talk about it. The perpetual requirement of loving words, looks, and caresses, and misconstruing their absence into absence of love, had been the great trial of her former married life. Now all went on clear and straight, under the guidance of her husband's strong sense, warm heart, and powerful will. Year by year their worldly prosperity increased. At Mrs Wilson's death, Nora came back to them as nurse to the newly born little Edwin, into which post she was not installed without a pretty strong oration on the part of the proud and happy father, who declared that if he found out that Nora ever tried to screen the boy by a falsehood, or to make him nesh either in body or mind, she should go that very day. Nora and Mr Openshaw were not on the most thoroughly cordial terms, neither of them fully recognising or appreciating the other's best qualities. This was the previous history of the Lancashire family who had now removed to London. They had been there about a year when Mr Openshaw suddenly informed his wife that he had determined to heal long-standing feuds, and had asked his uncle and aunt Chadwick to come and pay them a visit and see London. Mrs Openshaw had never seen this uncle and aunt of her husband's. Years before she had married him there had been a quarrel. All she knew was that Mr Chadwick was a small manufacturer in a country town in South Lancashire. She was extremely pleased that the breach was to be healed, and began making preparations to render their visit pleasant. They arrived at last. Going to see London was such an event for them that Mrs Chadwick had all new linen, fresh for the occasion, from nightcaps downwards, and as for gowns, ribbons, and collars, she might have been going into the wilds of Canada, where never a shop is, so large was her stock. A fortnight before the day of her departure for London, she had formally called to take leave of all her acquaintance, saying she should need every bit of the immediate time for packing up. It was like a second wedding in her imagination, and to complete the resemblance which an entirely new wardrobe made between the two events, her husband brought her back from Manchester on the last market day before they set off, a gorgeous pearl and amethyst brooch saying, London should see that Lancashire folks knew a handsome thing when they saw it. For some time after Mr. and Mrs. Chadwick arrived at the Openshaws there was no opportunity for wearing this brooch, but at length they obtained an order to see Buckingham Palace, and the spirit of loyalty demanded that Mrs. Chadwick should wear her best clothes in visiting the abode of her sovereign. On her return she hastily changed her dress, for Mr. Openshaw had planned that they should go to Richmond, drink tea, and return by moonlight. Accordingly, about 5 o'clock, Mr. and Mrs. Openshaw and Mr. and Mrs. Chadwick set off. The housemaid and cook sat below, Nora hardly knew where. She was always engrossed in the nursery in tending her 2 children, and in sitting by the restless, excitable Ailsie till she fell asleep. By and by the housemaid Betty tapped gently at the door. Nora went to her, and they spoke in whispers. "Nurse, there's someone downstairs wants you." "Wants me? Who is it?" "A gentleman." "A gentleman? Nonsense." "Well, a man, then. And he asks for you, and he rang at the front door-bell, and has walked into the dining-room." "You should never have let him!" exclaimed Nora. "Master and Missus out?" "I did not want him to come in. When he heard you lived here, he walked past me and sat down in the first chair, and said, 'Tell her to come and speak to me.' There is no gas lighted in the room, and supper is all set out." "He'll be off with the spoons!" exclaimed Nora, putting the housemaid's fear into words, and preparing to leave the room, first, however, giving a look to Ailsie, sleeping soundly and calmly. Downstairs she went, uneasy fears stirring in her bosom. Before she entered the dining-room, she provided herself with a candle, and, with it in her hand, she went in, looking around her in the darkness for her visitor. He was standing up, holding by the table. Nora and he looked at each other, gradual recognition coming into her eyes. "Nora?" at length he asked. "Who are you?" asked Nora, with the sharp tones of alarm and incredulity. "I don't know you," trying, by futile words of disbelief, to do away with the terrible fact before her. "Am I so changed?" he said pathetically. "I dare say I am. But, Nora, tell me," he breathed hard, "where is my wife? Is she alive?" He came nearer to Nora, and would have taken her hand, but she backed away from him, looking at him all the time with staring eyes, as if he were some horrible object. Yet he was a handsome, bronzed, good-looking fellow, with beard and moustache, giving him a foreign-looking aspect. But his eyes! There was no mistaking those eager, beautiful eyes, the very same that Nora had watched not half an hour ago, till sleep stole softly over them. "Tell me, Nora, I can't bear it. I have feared it so often. Is she dead?" Nora kept her silence. "She is dead." He hung on Nora's words and looks, as if for confirmation or contradiction. "What shall I do?" groaned Nora. "Oh, sir, why did you come? How did you find me out? Where have you been? We thought you dead. We did indeed." She poured out words and questions to gain time, as if time would help her. "Nora, answer me this question straight, but yes or no. Is my wife dead?" "No, she is not," said Nora slowly and heavily. "Oh, what a relief! Did she receive my letters? But perhaps you don't know. Why did you leave her? Where is she? Oh, Nora, tell me quickly." "Mr. Frank," said Nora at last, almost driven at bay by her terror lest her mistress should return at any moment and find him there, unable to consider what was best to be done or said, rushing at something decisive, because she could not endure her present state. "Mr. Frank, we never heard a line from you, and the ship-owners said you had gone down, you and everyone else. We thought you were dead, if ever man was, and poor Miss Alice and her little sick, helpless child. Oh, sir, you must guess it," cried the poor creature at last, bursting out into a passionate fit of crying. "For indeed I cannot tell it, but it was no one's fault. God help us all this night." Nora had sat down. She trembled too much to stand. He took her hands in his, He squeezed them hard, as if, by physical pressure, the truth could be wrung out. "Norah!" This time his tone was calm, stagnant as despair. "She has married again." Norah shook her head sadly. The grasp slowly relaxed. The man had fainted. There was brandy in the room. Norah forced some drops into Mr. Frank's mouth, chafed his hands, and, when mere animal life returned, before the mind poured in its flood of memories and thoughts, she lifted him up and rested his head against her knees. Then she put a few crumbs of bread taken from the supper-table, soaked in brandy, into his mouth. Suddenly he sprang to his feet. "Where is she? Tell me this instant!" He looked so wild, so mad, so desperate, that Norah felt herself to be in bodily danger. But her time of dread had gone by. She had been afraid to tell him the truth, and then she had been a coward. Now her wits were sharpened by the sense of his desperate state. He must leave the house. She would pity him afterwards, but now she must rather command and upbraid, for he must leave the house before her mistress came home. That one necessity stood clear before her. "She is not here. That is enough for you to know. Nor can I say exactly where she is," which was true to the letter, if not to the spirit. "Go away, and tell me where to find you to-morrow, and I will tell you all. My master and mistress may come back at any minute, and then what would become of me with a strange man in the house?" Such an argument was too petty to touch his excited mind. "I don't care for your master and mistress. If your master is a man, he must feel for me. Poor shipwrecked sailor that I am, kept for years a prisoner amongst savages, always, always, always thinking of my wife and my home, dreaming of her by night, talking to her though she could not hear by day. I loved her more than all heaven and earth put together. Tell me where she is, this instant, you wretched woman, who salved over her wickedness to her, as you do to me.